Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You are standing on a sheer rocky precipice overlooking the Zarafshan River Valley.
Right.
The year is 722. The summer heat is suffocating, just baking the arid mountains of Central Asia.
Yeah, it's a harsh environment.
And below you, winding its way through the dust and the scrub brush, is an army of the Umayyad Caliphate. Their banners are snapping in the dry wind, armor glinting in the sun, and they are coming for you.
Because you, in this scenario, are a Sogdian lord.
Exactly. You are a Sogdian lord named Devashtich. Your rebellion has failed, your forces have been shattered, and you have retreated to this fortress Mount Ma. It's this jagged citadel in the sky, basically a last resort.
The absolute end of the line.
Right. And knowing that the end is near, knowing the Arab siege engines are going to pound these walls to dust, you take your most precious possessions, and we aren't talking about gold or silver here.
No, it's a collection of delicate letters, legal contracts, diplomatic please-all written on leather, wood, and Chinese paper.
You hide them deep in a cave within the fortress, hoping they survive, even if you do not.
And, well, Devashtich did not survive. He was captured, he was executed, and his city was burned to the ground. But those documents he hid on Mount Mud, they did survive.
Yeah, they lay in the darkness of that mountain cave for over 1,200 years. Archaeologists finally uncovered them in the 20th century, and those documents are going to serve as a crucial anchor for our deep dive today.
They really are. Because today, we are looking at the Muslim conquest of Transoxiana.
Which is an era spanning the late 7th to the mid-8th centuries. It's a period that completely reshaped the geopolitical map of the world.
Completely. And what makes this specific deep dive so necessary is that for centuries, the only way historians could look at these events was through the lens of Abbasid-era Arabic chronicles.
Right, which were histories written by the victors long after the dust had settled.
Exactly. They framed this entire decades-long, incredibly bloody conflict as this linear, almost divinely ordained march of conquest. They create a picture of unified Arab armies just sweeping east and overcoming scattered resistance.
But when you actually crack open those surviving Mount Muv documents, when you read the unfiltered, panicked correspondence of the native Sogdian princes trying to buy mercenaries, negotiate truces, play empires against one another, you realize the official chronicles are heavily sanitized.
Oh, absolutely. The reality on the ground was a chaotic three-way collision.
You had the expanding Umayyad Caliphate pushing east. You had the native Sogdian principalities desperately trying to maintain their independence and their trade monopolies.
And then, descending from the steppes to the north, you have the massive, highly mobile cavalry armies of the nomadic Turgesh Khaganate.
So our job today, and we want to be very clear with you about this, is to cut through the propaganda from all sides.
Yeah, we are going to look strictly at the mechanics of this conflict.
Right. How did these empires actually function? How did they fight? How did they tax? And how did the geography itself become a weapon that swallowed entire armies? We are navigating these sources impartially, just looking strictly at the historical data to understand the harsh realities of the 8th century frontier.
And to understand that frontier, we really need to map the physical terrain first, because in Transoxiana, the geography dictates absolutely everything.
Let's establish those borders. The name Transoxiana, or in the Arabic sources, Mawara al-Nar, translates to that which is beyond the river.
And the river they're referring to is the Amu Darya.
Historically known to the Greeks as the Oxus.
Right, that is the southern boundary. If
Yeah.
you cross the Oxus heading north, you are in Transoxiana.
And the northern boundary is another massive river, the Sirdarya or the Jaxartes. So today, if you drop a pin on a map, we are talking about a huge swath of Central Asia, covering modern Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, the southern portions of Kazakhstan, and northern Kyrgyzstan.
It is an extreme environment. I mean, the space between those two great rivers is not some lush, continuous breadbasket. It is dominated by some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet.
Specifically, the Kizilkum and the Karakum deserts.
Yeah. Vast, arid expanses of red and black sand, scrub, and shifting dunes. Crossing them requires deep, deep logistical planning. An army cannot just march through the Kailokum and expect to forage for food or find water.
But cutting right through the heart of these wastelands are these incredibly vibrant, fertile river valleys.
And the most important of these for our narrative today is the Zarafshan Valley.
What's interesting about the Zarafshan River is that it doesn't actually flow into an ocean or a sea. It eventually just dissipates into the desert sands.
Right, but before it does, it creates a string of highly fertile oases. And the people who lived in these oases, the Sogdians, they were absolute masters of water management.
They didn't just rely on seasonal flooding, right?
No, They engineered an intricate, massive network of irrigation canals known as erics. These erics diverted the river water across wide plains, turning the dry dirt into dense, highly productive agricultural land.
And maintaining that kind of irrigation system requires a highly organized society. You need labor to dredge the canals, engineers to direct the flow, and a civic authority to manage the water rights.
Exactly. So out of this intense agricultural engineering, you get the rise of dense urban centers. And these urban centers are populated by the Sogdians.
They are an Eastern Iranian people. They speak a language closely related to the languages of the Persian Plateau.
But they have a completely distinct political identity. When the Arab armies first arrive at the Oxus, they are not looking across the water at a unified Sogdian empire.
Right. There is no central king sitting on a throne in a singular capital city.
Right. Instead of an empire, the Sogdians had developed a decentralized network of city-states. You have major fortified cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, Pekan, and Panjikent.
Each of these cities was essentially an autonomous principality.
Yeah, and at the top of the social hierarchy was a prince, holding the local title of Ikshid. But the Ikshid was not an absolute monarch. His power was constantly checked and balanced by the local nobility and, crucially, the wealthy merchant elite.
The sources referred to this civic community as the NAF. It's such a fascinating political structure. When you try to picture how this worked, you really shouldn't think of a traditional feudal kingdom.
No, not at all.
Think of something closer to the Hanseatic League in medieval Europe, or a network of highly organized corporate hubs. The entire society was geared toward one primary objective, and that was commerce.
The Sogdians were the undisputed masters of the Silk Road. For centuries leading up to the Arab conquests, Sogdian merchants dominated the Trans-Eurasian trade network.
They established merchant colonies stretching all the way from the borders of the Byzantine Empire in the west, deep into Tang Dynasty China in the east.
We have actually found ancient letters written by Sogdian merchants in western China, detailing the fluctuations in the price of silver, the movement of silk, the local demand for spices.
They were moving massive quantities of high-value luxury goods, furs from the Siberian forests, musk from Tibet, Indian spices, and Chinese silks.
And because they were sitting on this massive highway of global trade, their culture became incredibly cosmopolitan. Religiously, it was a melting pot.
The majority of the Sogdians practiced a local variant of Zoroastrianism. We know this from the archaeological record, right?
Yeah, they didn't bury their dead in the ground, which in their belief system would defile the sacred earth. Instead, they practiced excarnation, basically allowing the flesh to be consumed by scavengers, and then placed the bones in intricately carved ceramic boxes called ossuaries.
And they maintained fire temples in their cities.
But right alongside the Zoroastrians, you had thriving communities of Buddhists, Manichaeans, and Nestorian Christians.
This cultural and economic wealth made Transoxiana an incredibly tempting target for expansionist empires.
Natural.
But the Sogdian political structure, this decentralized network of mercantile city-states, created a really unique tactical situation for any invading force.
It's a massive double-edged sword. On one hand, because they are decentralized, there is no single target. An invading army cannot just march in, defeat a central king in one decisive battle, capture the capital, and demand the surrender of the whole nation.
Right. To conquer Transoxiana, you have to besiege Bukhara and then pack up your camp and besiege Samarkand and then move on to Pekan. You have to subdue the region block by block, city by city.
But the severe disadvantage for the Sogdians was their inability to mount a unified defense. Because these city-states were accustomed to competing with one another for trade dominance, they struggled to form lasting military coalitions.
They simply didn't have a standing, centralized army capable of meeting a massive imperial force in open combat.
Furthermore, their entire survival depended on trade. War disrupts trade. A prolonged siege destroys markets. So the Sogdian elite, the Ishids and the Naf, they developed a highly pragmatic approach to foreign invaders.
They were willing to pay.
Precisely. If a powerful force appeared on their horizon, whether it was the nomadic Turks from the steppes or the Chinese armies from the east, the Sogdians would often calculate the cost of war versus the cost of tribute.
If paying a heavy tribute meant the city avoided being sacked and the caravans could keep moving, they would just pay the tribute. They viewed nominal submission to an empire as a business expense, which is a perfectly rational strategy if you are dealing with an invader who just wants a cut of your profits.
Sure.
But that pragmatism is going to violently collide with the expansion of the Umayyad Caliphate, because the Umayyads were bringing a completely different ideology of conquest.
To trace the Umayyad offensive, we actually have to look back slightly. The Arab incursions into Central Asia didn't happen in a sudden, massive wave.
Right.
Following the rapid collapse of the Sassanid Persian Empire in the mid-7th century, Arab armies reached the southern banks of the Oxus River. And starting around 651, they began launching sporadic raids across the river into Transoxiana.
But these early raids were primarily focused on plunder, right?
Yeah. An Arab commander would cross the river in the summer, hit a few outlying towns, gather up slaves, silver, and livestock, and then retreat back across the Oxus before the winter set in.
Yeah.
It was border harassment, not a systematic attempt to occupy the territory.
The paradigm shifts completely under the Umayyad Caliphate, specifically during the tenure of a powerful, ruthless governor of Iraq named Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf.
Al-Hajjaj recognized the immense wealth of Transoxiana and wanted to incorporate it permanently into the empire. But to do that, he had to resolve a severe internal crisis within the Arab armies stationed in Khorasan, which was the easternmost province of the caliphate.
This is where we really have to unpack the tribal politics of the Arab military, because it dictates how this entire conquest plays out. The army was not a monolithic block of loyal soldiers.
No, it was deeply fractured along ancient tribal lines, specifically between two massive confederations, the Mudar and the Khatan.
The Mudar represented the northern Arab tribes, while the Khatan represented the southern tribes.
And this wasn't a minor cultural difference. This was a bitter, deeply entrenched rivalry. In the garrison towns of Khorasan, these factions competed fiercely for land grants, for shares of the plunder, and for political influence.
So when an Umayyad governor from the Mudar faction was appointed, he would favor his own tribesmen, stripping the Khatan of their privileges.
Which would inevitably lead to mutinies and assassinations.
And the Umayyad central government in Damascus actually exploited this division, didn't they?
They did. They would play the Mudar and the Khatan against each other to ensure that no single governor in the east ever became powerful enough to challenge the caliph. It was a classic divide-and-conquer strategy applied to their own military.
But it made launching a coordinated, years-long invasion across the Oxus nearly impossible.
Right. Recognizing this gridlock, Al-Hajjaj made a brilliant administrative move in 705. He appointed a new governor of Khorasan, Qutayba ibn Muslim.
Qutayba was a hardened military commander, but what made him the perfect choice was his lineage. He belonged to the Bahila tribe.
And the Bahila were a relatively small tribe that didn't heavily align with either the Mudar or the Khatan confederations. They were neutral ground.
Because Qutayba was Bahila, he could command the Mudar regiments without the Khatan instantly rebelling, and vice versa.
He possessed the unique political leverage necessary to unify that fractious Arab military machine and direct its full force across the river. Qutayba held this governorship from 705 until 715, a decade that fundamentally altered the history of Central Asia.
Qutayba immediately changes the nature of the war. He stops the seasonal raiding. His objective is occupation. And the first thing he does is tackle the geography.
He figures out how to move massive armies across the deserts without them dying of thirst, establishing reliable supply depots and negotiating safe passage through the arid zones.
His early campaigns focused on isolating the major city-states. He understood that he couldn't fight a united Sogdian front, so he utilized a mix of diplomacy and sheer military force to keep the Ishids divided.
He would ally with one city to secure his flank while besieging another. By 709, he successfully laid siege to and captured Bukhara, one of the wealthiest cities in the region.
We have to look at the mechanics of Qutayba's military strategy here. How does he actually sustain this push? He is thousands of miles from the heartland of the caliphate in Syria.
Yeah, he can't just request reinforcements from Damascus and expect them to arrive next week.
So he solved his manpower problem locally. Qutayba aggressively recruited native Khorasani and Transoxianian levies, often recent converts to Islam, incorporating them directly into his auxiliary units.
Furthermore, when he captured an enemy force, he frequently coerced the prisoners of war into serving in his own ranks. He built a hybrid army. But his most significant departure from previous commanders was his garrison strategy.
Right, he doesn't just raid and retreat. When Qutayba conquers a city, he forces the local population to evacuate a portion of the urban center, and he permanently installs an Arab military garrison right inside the walls.
He occupies the physical space. But what is truly striking about Qutayba is his administrative pragmatism. He used brutal, overwhelming violence to crush any military resistance. But once the city submitted, he generally kept the local tax structures and the local administration intact.
He essentially forces the surviving Sogdian elites to become his tax collectors. He leaves the Ikhshid in place, but now the Ikhshid's job is to extract wealth from his own people and hand it over to the Arab garrison.
It is a highly efficient way to run an occupation because you outsource the most unpopular part of governing to the native rulers.
But this system only works if the threat of violence is absolute.
Right. The Sogdians had to believe that breaking the tribute agreements would result in total destruction. And Qutayba proved this in 708 at the city of Peykand.
The fate of Peykand is chilling. Peykand was known as the city of merchants. Qutayba had captured it, imposed a heavy tribute, installed a small Arab garrison, and marched his main army away.
But shortly after he left, a rumor spread in Peykand that Qutayba had been killed in a distant battle.
Believing the Umayyad threat was gone, the local population of Peykand rebelled. They attacked the Arab garrison, expelled them, and declared their independence.
But Qutayba was not dead. When the news of the rebellion reached his camp, he immediately turned his army around and force-marched back to Peykand.
And the reprisal is engineered to be a psychological weapon. When Qutayba breaches the walls of Peykand the second time, he doesn't ask for tribute.
No, he executes the fighting men of the city, he enslaves the civilian populace, he strips the city of its wealth, including massive silver idols from the local temples, which he melts down to pay his troops. He effectively liquidates one of the richest cities on the Silk Road.
It was an act of calculated terror. Qutayba destroyed Peykand to send a message to Bukhara, to Samarkand, and to every other Ikhshid in the valley. The era of paying temporary tribute and then rebelling when the army leaves is over. Submission must be total.
And this methodical, terrifying approach reaches its climax when Qutayba turns his army toward the ultimate prize in the region, Samarkand.
Samarkand was the jewel of the Zarafshan Valley, heavily fortified and immensely wealthy. By 710, the political situation inside Samarkand perfectly illustrates the internal crisis facing the Sogdian society.
The ruling Ikhshid of Samarkand was a man named Tarkun.
Tarkun has seen what happened to Peykand. He has seen Bukhara fall, so he calculates that fighting Qutayba is suicide.
Tarkun negotiates a peace agreement, recognizing Arab suzerainty and agreeing to pay a massive annual tribute to keep the Umayyad army away from his walls. He is prioritizing the survival of the Silk Road commerce.
But Tarkun's pragmatism deeply offended the Naf, the civic community of Samarkand.
The nobility and the merchants viewed Tarkun's submission as a humiliating betrayal. They believed the city's walls were strong enough to withstand a siege, and they resented the immense financial drain the tribute would cause.
So the merchant oligarchs take action. They organize a coup within the city, they depose Tarkun, imprison him, and Tarkun, facing execution or exile, commits suicide.
In his place, the Naf elevates a new leader, a hardliner named Gurak, who is firmly committed to resisting the Umayyads.
Now, under normal circumstances, a client king being deposed by an anti-Umayyad faction would trigger an immediate military response from Qutayba. But in 710, Qutayba actually accepts Gurak's ascension and confirms him as a tributary vassal.
Yeah, that seems counterintuitive, right?
Wait, so why does he accept this? If his entire strategy is based on absolute submission, why let the hardline faction in Samarkand get away with killing his allied Ikhshid?
It comes down to the brutal realities of ancient logistics. At that specific moment, Qutayba's supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. He had elements of his army engaged in pacifying other regions.
Ah, so he couldn't commit to a siege.
Exactly. Launching a massive, resource-intensive siege against a fortified powerhouse like Samarkand was an operational risk he simply could not afford at that moment. He needed time to consolidate his forces and secure his rear. It was a tactical pause.
He is waiting for the right moment. And that moment arrives 2 years later in 712. Qutayba marches on Samarkand with a combined force of over 20,000 men, heavily reinforced with local Khurasani levies.
Gurak prepares for a siege, desperately sending envoys to the neighboring principalities and even to the steppe nomads, begging for relief forces.
But Qutayba intercepts the relief columns and defeats them in the field. He then tightens the noose around Samarkand, deploying heavy siege engines to batter the walls for over a month.
You have to imagine the scene inside the city. The trade routes are cut. The food is running out. The walls are crumbling under the constant bombardment.
Gurak realizes no one is coming to save him. To avoid the fate of Peykand, Gurak formally surrenders Samarkand to Qutayba.
The specifics of the surrender treaty, which were preserved in the Arabic historical tradition, provide incredible insight into the economic scale of this conquest. Qutayba didn't just demand nominal submission. He drained the wealth of the city.
The numbers are staggering. Gurak has to pay an immediate indemnity of 1 million mirhams.
A dirham was a standard silver coin of the era, so we were talking about a mountain of silver up front.
On top of that, an annual tribute of 200,000 dirhams.
The treaty also stipulated a tribute in human lives. Samarkand was required to provide an annual quota of slaves, and the Umayyads were highly specific. They demanded healthy adult slaves, explicitly excluding children, the elderly, or the infirm. They wanted labor and military manpower.
The sources even mention that the treaty standardized the exchange rates for local goods because they couldn't always pay in raw silver.
Right. Pieces of silk were valued at 28 dirhams. Large garments were valued at 100 dirhams. The Umayyad administration is essentially setting up a heavily regulated extraction economy.
Furthermore, Qutayba demanded one-third of the wealth stored in the Zoroastrian fire temples and Buddhist shrines. He systematically stripped the religious institutions of their accumulated silver and gold.
But the most profound change Qutayba makes is political. He fundamentally alters how Samarkand is governed. He mandates that from this point forward, the rule of the city will be strictly hereditary, passed down to Gurak's sons.
This was a deliberate surgical strike against the power of the Naf. By enforcing dynastic hereditary rule, Qutayba destroyed the oligarchic system.
The civic community could no longer elect, check, or depose their leader. Gurak's authority no longer derived from the consent of the nobility. It derived entirely from the swords of the Umayyad army. Qutayba isolated the Ikhshid from his own people.
And to enforce this new reality physically, Qutayba orders Gurak and his retinue to leave Samarkand. They have to build a new settlement outside the city called Farankath.
Meanwhile, Qutayba installs a massive Arab garrison directly inside Samarkand citadel, complete with the construction of a mosque. The capital of the Sogdian network is now an Umayyad military base.
It is a brilliant administrative setup. Qutayba minimizes the number of Arab bureaucrats he needs by forcing Gurak to collect the taxes, but he keeps his troops in the citadel to ensure compliance.
However, this entire system, this delicate balance of terror and taxation, relied heavily on the personal authority and the unbroken military success of Qutayba himself.
And in 715, the foundation of that authority cracks. Far away in Damascus, Caliph al-Walid I dies. His brother, Suleiman, takes the throne.
This is a catastrophe for Qutayba. The new caliph, Suleiman, was a bitter political rival of Qutayba's patron, al-Hajjaj. Qutayba correctly assesses that the new regime will likely strip him of his governorship, and perhaps even execute him.
So Qutayba takes a massive gamble. He decides to preemptively rebel against the new caliph. He gathers his army in Khorasan and asks them to march against Damascus.
But he drastically miscalculates the loyalty of his own men. The Arab troops were exhausted after a decade of continuous grueling campaigning in Central Asia.
Furthermore, the tribal fault lines, the Mudar and the Khotan factions that Qutayba had so carefully balanced, split open again. They had no interest in fighting a civil war against the caliph to save their governor's career.
The army mutinies. Qutayba's own troops attack his tent and kill him, but the architect of the conquest is dead.
And with Qutayba's death, the illusion of Umayyad invincibility shatters. The Arab forces are paralyzed by internal divisions and a total lack of leadership.
For the Sogdian princes who had been bled dry by the tribute demands, this is the moment they have been waiting for.
The Ikhshids immediately stop paying the tribute. They expel the smaller Arab garrisons. And crucially, they send desperate embassies to the north and east, seeking a military alliance with the only power capable of facing the Umayyads in open war.
The Turkish Khaganate.
The Turgesh were a formidable nomadic empire that had emerged from the collapse of the older Western Turkic Khaganate.
Based in the steppes of modern Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, the Turgesh were at the height of their power under a brilliant military leader named Suluk Khagan, who ruled from 716 to 738.
We really have to understand how fundamentally different the Turkish military machine was from the Umayyad army. The Umayyads relied heavily on disciplined infantry blocks, supported by cavalry, operating from fortified garrison towns. Their strength was siege warfare and holding territory.
The Turgesh, conversely, were masters of steppe cavalry warfare. The core of their army was the mounted archer wielding the composite bow.
And these bows, constructed from layers of horn, wood, and sinew, were absolute engineering marvels. They had an incredibly high draw weight and could loose arrows with enough force to penetrate Arab chainmail at close range.
And the mobility of the Turkish was terrifying. An Umayyad infantry column might march 15 or 20 miles a day, dragging a massive baggage train of food, water, and fodder.
Right, while the Turkish cavalry traveled with strings of remounts, multiple horses per warrior. They could cover vast distances rapidly, striking a supply line and vanishing before the Umayyad heavy cavalry could even form up to pursue them.
They employed tactics like the feigned retreat. They would engage the Arab lines, unleash volleys of arrows, and then suddenly break and flee in apparent panic.
And if the Arab infantry or cavalry broke their disciplined formations to chase the fleeing nomads,
The Turkish would suddenly wheel their horses around and unleash a devastating counterattack, cutting the disordered Arab forces to pieces.
when you combine the speed and hitting power of the Turkish cavalry with the native Sogdian infantry, who knew the mountain passes and the river crossings intimately, you have a coalition uniquely designed to dismantle the Umayyad occupation.
This alliance immediately went to work. In 722, we see a major flare-up in the region, centered around that Sogdian lord we mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Divashtich.
He was the ruler of Panjikent, one of the wealthiest cities in the region, famous for its incredible mural paintings. He leads a massive revolt, explicitly tying his cause to the Turgesh alliance.
He manages to seize control of significant territory in the Zarafshan Valley.
But the Umayyads, recognizing the severity of the threat, dispatch a highly capable and brutal commander named al-Harashi. Al-Harashi aggressively pushes back against the rebels, utilizing superior numbers to force Divashtich out of the fertile valley and up into the harsh, arid mountains.
Which brings us back to Mount Ma. Divashtich and the remnants of his forces retreat to this fortified peak. The Arab forces surround the mountain and lay siege. Knowing they cannot break out, Divashtich's administration hides their archives in the cave.
The Mount Ma documents are an unparalleled treasure for historians. They contain over 70 documents written predominantly in Sogdian, but also in Arabic, Turkic, and Chinese.
And what actually is in these documents? Because it's not just poetry, right? It's the raw data of a collapsing society.
They are incredibly mundane and simultaneously tragic. You have diplomatic letters where Divashtich is writing to the ruler of modern Tashkent, desperately begging for the Turgesh army to arrive faster, warning that the Arabs are closing in.
But right alongside these pleas for survival, you have meticulous financial records.
Right. There are legal contracts detailing the lease of a watermill. There are marriage contracts specifying exactly how much silver is owed in a dowry. There are receipts for the purchase of leather goods.
It shows us a highly literate, heavily bureaucratized society desperately trying to maintain its legal and economic norms, even as an invading army literally surrounds their final stronghold.
It humanizes the Sogdians in a way the Arabic chronicles never do.
Ultimately, the Turgesh relief force does not arrive in time. Divashtich is forced to surrender. He is taken prisoner. The Arabs burn Penjikent to the ground, and al-Harashi orders Divash to be crucified on a Zoroastrian burial structure as a warning to other rebels.
But despite the tragic end of Divashtich, his rebellion was a symptom of a much larger collapse. Throughout the 720s, the Turkish-Sogdian alliance inflicted a series of catastrophic defeats on the Umayyads, pushing them out of the river valleys and forcing them onto the defensive.
The tipping point of this momentum shift occurs in 724. It's an event that the Arab chronicles refer to simply and ominously as the Day of Thirst.
The Umayyad governor at the time, Muslim ibn Sayyid al-Kilabi, recognized that the caliphate was losing its grip. He decided to launch a major offensive into the Fergana Valley, a wealthy region in the far east of Transoxiana that had allied with the Turgesh.
Muslim ibn Said marches his army across the Jaxartes River, advances deep into the Fergana Valley, and lays siege to the main city. But then, his scouts ride in with terrifying intelligence.
They report that Seluk Khan himself is rapidly approaching with the main body of the Turgesh horde. The Umayyad army is deep in hostile territory, far from their supply bases, and a vastly superior, highly mobile enemy is about to cut off their escape route.
Wait, so they just abandoned the siege completely?
They had to. The governor realizes the siege is impossible. He orders an immediate retreat. The Umayyad army lifts the siege, turns around, and begins force marching back west toward the Jaxartes River.
This begins an 8-day logistical nightmare. The Turkish cavalry catches up to the retreating Arab column. For over a week, the Umayyads are subjected to constant grinding harassment.
The Turgesh archers ride up, pour arrows into the dense Arab ranks, and ride away. The Arab infantry is forced to march in tight defensive formations under a hail of arrows.
And the environment turns against them. They are marching through arid, dusty terrain in the heat of summer. Their water supplies run dangerously low. When they finally approach the Jaxartes River, salvation seems close, but they find their path blocked.
The local Sogdian forces from the Kingdom of Shash allied with the Turgesh have positioned themselves between the Umayyad army and the river.
So picture the strategic trap. You have the Umayyad army exhausted, dehydrated, and demoralized. Behind them, the massive Turgesh cavalry is closing in for the kill. In front of them, an allied native army blocks the only water source.
Faced with total annihilation, the Umayyad command makes a desperate decision. They realize they cannot maneuver while protecting their massive logistical train.
So they order their own men to set fire to their baggage train. They burn the tents, the extra supplies, they plunder everything that slows them down.
Driven mad by thirst and panic, the unburdened Arab infantry launches a frantic, disorganized frontal assault against the blocking forces of Shash. It is a brutal, chaotic melee.
They manage to punch a hole through the enemy lines and spill into the river, drinking the muddy water even as they wade across.
They survive, but at a horrific cost. The army suffers massive casualties, they lose all their equipment, and they retreat back to safety as a battered, shattered remnant of an expeditionary force.
The Day of Thirst completely broke the offensive capability of the Umayyads in that decade. The Turgesh had utilized the vast distances and the lack of water to turn a disciplined invasion into a rout.
Following this retreat, the Arab garrisons across Transoxiana were isolated and systematically destroyed. The Caliphate lost nearly all of the territory Qutayba had conquered, clinging only to the immediate area around Samarkand.
And their desperation to hold on to Samarkand would lead directly to the most catastrophic military disaster the Umayyad Empire would suffer in the east.
We are jumping forward now to July 731. The Turgesh, sensing blood in the water, have crossed the region and placed Samarkand under heavy siege.
The Umayyad governor of Khorasan is a man named Junayd ibn Ablad al-Rahman al-Mori. He receives urgent pleas from the Samarkand garrison. If relief does not arrive, the city will fall.
Junayd understands the strategic stakes. If Samarkand falls, the Umayyad presence across the Oxus is finished. So he mobilizes a massive relief army, stripping the garrisons of Khorasan of their best troops. He assembles a force of 28,000 men and marches towards Samarkand.
To reach Samarkand from the south, Junayd's army has to cross the Zarashan mountain range. The most direct route is through a narrow, treacherous gorge known as the Taktakaracha Pass.
The Arabic sources refer to what happens next as Waqat al-Shib, the Battle of the Defile, or the Battle of the Pass.
Junayd's decision to march 28,000 men into a narrow mountain pass is a textbook tactical error, especially considering the intelligence deficit he was operating under.
He was relying on local Sogdian guides to navigate the terrain, but the loyalties of the region had completely shifted.
Remember Gurak, the pragmatic Tikshid of Samarkand who had surrendered to Qutayba years ago.
Yeah, Gurak has read the winds shifting. He realizes the Umayyads are losing, so he has quietly allied himself with Suluk Khagan and the Turgesh.
And Gurak provides the Turgesh with exact intelligence on Junayd's route. Suluk Khagan moves a massive coalition force of Turgesh cavalry and native Sogdian infantry into the heights above the Taktakaracha Pass. They wait in perfect silence as the vanguard of the Umayyad army enters the gorge.
You really have to imagine the claustrophobia of this. You have tens of thousands of men, horses, and supply wagons stretched out in a long, vulnerable column, trapped between steep rock walls. You cannot form a battle line. You cannot maneuver.
When the trap is sprung, the slaughter is absolute. The Turgesh and Sogdian forces attack from the ridges above. They roll massive boulders down the cliffs, crushing horses and men.
They rain down arrows into the densely packed column. They use incendiary weapons to set the baggage train on fire, creating choking smoke in the narrow confines of the pass.
The battle doesn't just last a few hours. It grinds on for 3 agonizing days. Junayd's army is cut into fragments, fighting desperate, isolated pockets of resistance.
Recognizing his army is being annihilated, Junayd manages to dispatch a messenger who slips through the enemy lines and reaches the besieged city of Samarkand.
Junayd sends a direct order to the commander of the Samarkand garrison, a man named Sara ibn al-Hur. The order is basically suicidal. Sara must take his 12,000 men, march out of the fortified city, and attack the Turkish forces from the rear to relieve the pressure on the pass.
Sara knows this is a death sentence. Marching infantry out into the open against a superior nomadic cavalry force is exactly what the Turkish want. But he has his orders. He marches his 12,000 men out of the gates.
Suluk Khagan's battlefield awareness is exceptional here. He leaves a blocking force in the pass to keep Junayd pinned down and wheels his main cavalry force around to intercept Sara on the open plains before he can even reach the mountains.
The Turgesh cavalry surrounds Sara's 12,000 men. They used their classic step tactics, circling the Arab infantry, pouring arrows into their ranks, slowly bleeding them to death. The heat is intense, the Arab troops are cut off from water, and their formations eventually disintegrate.
The annihilation of the relief force is nearly total. Of the 12,000 men who marched out of Samarkand under Sara, the sources indicate fewer than 1,000 survived the slaughter. Sara himself is killed.
Back in the pass, Junaid manages to rally a battered remnant of his forces. Through sheer desperation and incredibly heavy fighting, he breaks through the Turgesh blockade and limps into Samarkand.
So technically, in a strictly operational sense, Junaid achieved his primary objective. He reached Samarkand and reinforced the garrison, preventing the city from falling to Sulik Khagan.
But historians classify this as one of the greatest Pyrrhic victories of the era. The cost of reaching Samarkand was apocalyptic. The Arab chronicles, even with their bias, admit that the Umayyads lost between 20,000 and 30,000 men over those few days.
The Battle of the Defile broke the back of Umayyad military power in the east. Junaid sacrificed his entire eastern field army. The demographic impact on the garrison towns of Khorasan was devastating. Entire regiments were wiped out, leaving thousands of widows and orphans.
And the strategic ripple effects hit the very core of the empire. Damascus can no longer rely on the Khorasani army to defend the frontier.
Right, the central government is forced to strip thousands of elite troops from other volatile fronts, specifically from Iraq and Syria, and march them thousands of miles east just to hold the line against the Turgesh.
This immense strain on manpower and finances destabilizes the entire Umayyad state. Despite the influx of reinforcements, the Umayyad position remained incredibly fragile.
The Turgesh continued to raid deep into Arab territory. In 737, we see another humiliating engagement known as the Battle of the Baggage, where the Turgesh successfully ambush and capture the entire supply train of the Umayyad governor Asad ibn Abdallah al-Khazri. The Arab armies are paralyzed, unable to project force.
But then, the geopolitical chessboard flips again. Not because of a decisive battle, but because of the fragile nature of nomadic empires. Around 737 or 738, two massive figures in this conflict die.
First, Gurak, the ultimate survivor who played the empires against each other for decades, passes away. Without his authority, the unified Sogdian resistance splinters.
And far more consequentially, Sulik Khagan is assassinated by a rival faction within his own court.
The Turgesh Khaganate was held together largely by Suluk's personal charisma and military genius. With him gone, the empire instantly disintegrates into a violent civil war.
The massive coalition that had battered the Umayyads dissolves, and power on the steppes eventually shifts to a new group, the Karlup Turks, who are not yet unified enough to pose a major threat.
This sudden power vacuum allowed the Umayyads to finally go on the offensive again, systematically recapturing the rebellious cities. But winning the war is very different from winning the peace. The administrative policies the Umayyads imposed to fund this massive military recovery generated a deep, simmering hatred among the population.
We have to look at how the taxation actually worked, because this is the engine of the coming revolution. The Umayyad administration relied on two primary taxes. The first is the kharaj, which is an agricultural land tax.
The state would take roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of a farmer's total yield. It is a crushing burden on an agricultural society recovering from decades of war.
The second tax is the jizya. The jizya is a poll tax, a per capita tax levied specifically on non-Muslim subjects living under Islamic rule. Now, according to strict Islamic law and tradition, if a Zoroastrian or Buddhist Sogdian converted to Islam, they became a part of the Muslim community and were legally exempt from paying the jizya.
But the Umayyad administration in Transoxiana had a massive financial problem. They had spent decades bleeding silver to fight the Turgesh. If mass numbers of Sogdians converted to Islam and stopped paying the jizya, the state's revenue would collapse.
So the Umayyad governors made a highly pragmatic but deeply controversial decision. They prioritized revenue over religious doctrine. When native populations converted to Islam, the Umayyad tax collectors frequently ignored their conversion and demanded they continue paying the jizya anyway.
They are telling the locals, we don't care that you pray at the mosque now, you still owe us the silver. And it gets even more intrusive. The sources note that around the year 720, the Umayyad administration implemented strict, humiliating tests to verify conversions.
They decreed that adult men who claimed to have converted must undergo circumcision to prove their sincerity.
This policy was incredibly offensive to the local populations, particularly to the Zoroastrian nobility who had embraced Islam seeking political equality. It demonstrated clearly that the Umayyad elite viewed them not as spiritual brethren, but purely as a tax base to be exploited.
And this systemic abuse doesn't just alienate the native Sogdians. It alienates the local Arab soldiers living in Khorasan.
These soldiers have intermarried with the locals, they speak Persian, and they resent the arrogant Umayyad elites sent from Syria who hoard all the wealth and plunder.
This widespread anger is a crucial context missing from the later Abbasid historical chronicles. As we discussed earlier, historians like al-Tabari or al-Balaturi wrote their accounts under the Abbasid dynasty, which overthrew the Umayyads.
Right, how does their specific bias warp the history of these events?
The Abbasid historians had a very specific ideological goal, which was to portray the Umayyads as corrupt, impious, and unworthy of the caliphate. So when they narrate military disasters like the Day of Thirst or the Battle of the Defile, they often frame the defeats not as a result of the superior tactical capabilities of the Turgesh, but as divine punishment for the sins of the Umayyad commanders.
They blame the losses on arrogant leadership, on tribal infighting, or on betrayal by local guides, rather than admitting that Seljuk Kogan was simply a better general commanding a more lethal army on that specific day.
Exactly. They underestimate the sophisticated military mechanics of the nomadic forces to fit a neat moral narrative about Umayyad decadence. But while their moral framing is biased, the consequences of that Umayyad decadence were very real.
Think about the immense scale of what occurred here. For 30 years, the Umayyad Caliphate poured a river of blood and silver into the sands of Transoxiana. Tens of thousands of men died in the mountain passes and the deserts. The local populations were taxed into poverty.
And all of that localized trauma directly fueled a global geopolitical earthquake. The Khurasani soldiers, this hybrid army of Arab settlers and newly converted Iranians, were exhausted, heavily taxed, and completely disillusioned by Damascus. They felt they had borne the brunt of the frontier meat grinder while the elites in Syria grew rich.
So in 750, they channel that rage. This battle-hardened, furious frontier army becomes the vanguard of the Abbasid Revolution. They raise the black banners of rebellion, march west out of Khorasan, and systematically destroy the Umayyad military, entirely overthrowing the dynasty and establishing the Abbasid Caliphate.
And just 1 year later, in 751, the new Abbasid forces, alongside their local allies, decisively defeat the expanding Chinese Tang dynasty at the Battle of Talas.
That battle effectively halts Chinese expansion into Central Asia forever and cements the region firmly within the Islamic sphere of influence.
So the military borders are finally drawn. The wars of conquest fade. But the cultural transformation of Transoxiana is infinitely more complex than a change of flags on a map.
The Arab conquest unequivocally dismantled the ancient Sogdian political structure. The power of the Naf, the merchant oligarchies, was broken. The autonomous city-states were absorbed into a centralized imperial administration. And gradually, over centuries, Islam replaced Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Manichaeism as the dominant religion.
But the intense, decades-long resistance mounted by figures like Gurak and Devashtich, supported by the Turgesh cavalry, was not entirely in vain. It did something crucial.
It bought time. The sheer ferocity of the defense prevented the Umayyads from simply steamrolling the region and imposing total, immediate Arabization.
It forced the conquerors to compromise. Because the Arabs had to rely on local administrators to collect taxes and manage the irrigation networks, the native Persian-Iranian heritage of the region survived. It was battered, it was heavily taxed, but it endured.
And what emerges from this crucible is a profound cultural hybridity. The native traditions of the Sogdians blended seamlessly with the new Islamic administrative and religious structures. They created a unique Persianate-Islamic synthesis.
A synthesis that eventually gives rise to one of the most brilliant eras in Central Asian history. By the 9th century, as Abbasid centralized control wanes, a native Iranian dynasty called the Samanid Empire rises to power in Transoxiana.
The Samanids champion a massive cultural renaissance. They build a localized Islamic golden age of literature, science, architecture, and revitalized Silk Road trade, all built directly upon the ashes of the old Sogdian city-states. The blood soaked into the sands of Bukhara and Samarkand eventually watered a new, vibrant civilization.
So we started this deep dive talking about maps, the comforting, linear narrative of one solid color washing over a continent. But the reality of the Muslim conquest of Transoxiana proves that history is never a solid color. It is a messy, terrifying collision of empires, nomadic cavalry archers, and pragmatic merchants trying to survive the storm.
It is a story where the climate and the geography fight back, where a narrow mountain pass can swallow an army of thousands, and where a shattered world eventually, painstakingly, knits itself back together into something entirely new.
It reminds us that historical truth is rarely found in the sweeping proclamations of the victors. It is found in the desperate, mundane details, in a merchant's contract hidden in a mountain cave, or in the ashes of a burned baggage train on the banks of a desert river.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.